For nearly a century, the name Lee Radziwill existed primarily as a footnote to a much larger American epic, a fate she navigated with a mixture of grace and silent suffering. Born into the gilded cage of the Bouvier family, Caroline Lee was never simply herself. She was the younger half of a duo that the world insisted on ranking from the moment of her birth. While the public saw a woman of immense privilege, moving through the high society corridors of Manhattan and Paris, the reality was a lifelong struggle to claim a singular identity. Her story is often framed through the lens of her sister, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, but to view Lee only through that shadow is to miss the complexity of a woman who was a pioneer of style and a survivor of immense personal tragedy. When she passed away at the age of 85, the media once again prioritized her sister's name in the headlines, proving that the world had never truly learned how to see Lee as a primary protagonist in her own right. The hierarchy of the Bouvier sisters was established in the nursery and reinforced by a mother, Janet Auchincloss, who viewed her daughters as assets to be groomed for social dominance. From the beginning, Jackie was the intellectual athlete, the one who possessed an innate, quiet authority that demanded respect and attention. Lee, 4 years younger, was often relegated to the role of the pretty one, a label that was meant as a compliment but acted as a prison. This distinction created a friction that would last for decades, as Lee watched how easily admiration flowed toward her sister while she had to work twice as hard to be noticed. Their childhood homes on Park Avenue and the sprawling estates of East Hampton were beautiful on the surface, but they were built on the shaky ground of their father's alcoholism and their parents' volatile marriage. These early years taught Lee that appearances were a shield, and that beauty was a currency used to buy a moment of peace in a chaotic world. As the sisters matured, the differences between them became the defining characteristics of their public personas, creating a narrative of rivalry that the press would eventually feast upon. Lee was social, vivacious, and possessed a refined eye for aesthetics that would later make her a legend in the world of interior design, yet these qualities were often dismissed as superficial compared to Jackie's historical weight. By the time she reached her 20s, Lee was desperate for an escape from the stifling atmosphere of her mother's control and the constant comparisons to her sister. She sought this liberation through marriage, wedging herself into the social elite of London with Michael Canfield. However, this first foray into independence was a facade, as the marriage was plagued by Michael's drinking and the realization that she had traded one form of confinement for another. Even in her attempt to flee, she found herself trapped in a life that looked perfect in photographs but felt hollow and isolating in reality. The dynamic between the sisters shifted irrevocably when Jackie married John F. Kennedy, a move that vaulted one sister into the center of the political universe and left the other in the role of a permanent spectator. As Jackie became a global icon and the First Lady of the United States, the space for Lee's own identity seemed to shrink until it was almost non-existent. Lee did not harbor a simple, petty resentment of her sister's success, but rather a profound frustration with the lack of room for her own growth. No matter what she achieved, whether it was marrying a Polish prince or becoming a fixture of the international jet set, her accomplishments were always weighed against the massive gravity of the White House. This imbalance defined the middle years of her life, leading her to seek out grander titles and more influential friends in a tireless effort to create a world where she was the undisputed center of gravity. The tragedy in Dallas in 1963 was a turning point not just for the nation, but for the intricate psychological bond between the two sisters. In the immediate aftermath, Lee was the quiet pillar of support, rushing to her sister's side and helping her navigate the unimaginable grief of a public assassination. She performed the duties of a sister with impeccable poise, standing behind the veils and the processions, absorbing the trauma of the event while the world watched Jackie. Yet years later, Lee would confess that the death of the president brought with it a strange, guilty sense of liberation. The rigid rules of the Kennedy administration, which had dictated every move of those in its orbit, had suddenly evaporated. For a brief moment, the heavy mantle of being the First Lady's sister felt lighter, though this feeling was quickly buried under the weight of Jackie's continuing needs and the collective expectations of a mourning public. In the wake of the Kennedy era, Lee Radziwill began a restless search for a career and a passion that could finally be called her own, untainted by family associations. She turned to the world of acting, a move that was both brave and perhaps a bit desperate, as she sought the validation of the public eye on her own terms. Her debut in the Philadelphia Story was a massive media event, but the critics were unforgiving, viewing her performance as an amateur intrusion into a professional craft. This failure was a devastating blow to her ego, not because she was a poor performer, but because the world refused to let her be anything other than a socialite playing at a profession. It was a cruel irony. When she tried to step out from the shadow and stand on a stage, the very spotlight she sought became the instrument of her public humiliation, reinforcing the idea that she was meant to be seen and not heard. During this period of professional wandering, Lee's relationship with Aristotle Onassis became a source of intense speculation and eventually deep-seated family tension. Onassis was a man of immense power and wealth who treated Lee with a focused intensity that she had rarely experienced within her own family circle. He listened to her, valued her opinions, and made her feel like the most important person in the room, a feeling that was intoxicating for a woman who had spent decades as a secondary consideration. However, the entrance of Jackie into this relationship changed everything, leading to a betrayal that would fracture the sisters' bond for years. When Onassis ultimately chose to marry Jackie instead of Lee, it was a crushing confirmation of the old hierarchy. Once again, the world, and even the man who claimed to admire her most, had pivoted toward the sister whose presence simply carried more weight. Despite the public setbacks and personal betrayals, Lee eventually found her true calling in the world of aesthetics and interior design, where her innate taste could finally flourish. Unlike the stage, the world of high-end design allowed her to work with a level of discretion and control that suited her temperament perfectly. She became a consultant for major fashion houses and designed homes that were celebrated for their understated elegance and sophisticated blend of historical and modern elements. In this sphere, she was not Jackie's sister. She was a tastemaker whose influence was sought after by the global elite. This professional success provided her with a sense of agency that had eluded her for most of her life, proving that she possessed a talent that was independent of her last name or her royal titles. It was a quiet victory, but one that allowed her to build a foundation that was entirely her own. However, the 1990s brought a series of losses that would strip away the remaining layers of her carefully constructed world, beginning with the death of Jackie in 1994. The passing of her sister was a profound existential crisis for Lee. She had lost the person who was both her greatest rival and her most intimate confidant. The reading of Jackie's will provided a final, stinging reminder of their complicated relationship, as Lee was left with sentimental items but excluded from the vast financial legacy. This was not necessarily an act of malice by Jackie, but rather a practical decision reflecting Lee's own social standing, yet it felt like a final word in their lifelong dialogue. Without Jackie, the social landscape of Lee's life began to shift, as many of the people who had flocked to her did so only to be near the flame of the Kennedy legacy. She was forced to confront a reality where the shadow was gone, but so was much of the light it had provided. The most devastating blow came in 1999 with the death of her son, Anthony Radziwill, after a grueling battle with cancer. Anthony was the light of Lee's life, a successful filmmaker who had managed to forge his own path away from the family drama. His death broke something inside Lee that could never be mended, as the natural order of life was violated in the most painful way possible. In the years following this tragedy, Lee withdrew from the public eye, selling her grander properties and simplifying her existence. The woman who had once been the toast of two continents now found herself in a process of radical reduction. She was no longer competing for space or seeking the approval of a world that had never truly understood her. In the quiet of her final decade, she was finally left with the one thing she had always wanted, a life that belonged solely to her. Part 3: The Legacy of the Final Choice. The final years of Lee Radziwill were a masterclass in aging with defiance and a quiet, sharpened intelligence. She remained a fixture of elegance, her style evolving into something minimal and essential, reflecting a woman who no longer had anything to prove to the galleries. She lived surrounded by the books, art, and memories she had curated over a lifetime, maintaining a small circle of friends who valued her for her wit and her survivor's spirit. While the world still occasionally gossiped about the old rivalries of the 60s, Lee had moved beyond them, focusing instead on the legacy she would leave for her daughter, Anna Christina. Her life had been a long exercise in navigating the expectations of others, and as she neared the end, she began to make the final, decisive arrangements for her own exit from the stage she had occupied for so long. When Lee passed away in February 2019, the public reaction was a predictable echo of the past, with every obituary framing her through the lens of her association with the Kennedys. The irony was palpable. Even in death, she was not allowed to be the lead story without a reference to the sister who had predeceased her by 25 years. However, beneath the superficial media coverage lay a final act of agency that revealed Lee's true priorities and her ultimate rejection of the secondary status she had been assigned. Her will was a document of striking clarity and intent, a final communication from a woman who had spent 85 years being compared to others. It was here, in the cold legal language of estates and beneficiaries, that Lee Radziwill finally spoke for herself without the need for a translator or a comparison. Her decision to leave her entire estate to her daughter was a radical departure from the complicated, often fractured distributions of wealth seen in dynastic families. By concentrating her legacy in one person, she ensured that her daughter would never have to experience the feeling of being a second consideration or a footnote in a larger family trust. This choice was an act of profound maternal love, but it was also a retrospective correction of her own life's narrative. She was effectively ending the cycle of comparison and hierarchy that had defined the Bouvier and Radziwill lines for generations. In her final legal act, she removed the shadows and the partitions, ensuring that the person she loved most would stand in a clear, unobstructed light, the very light that Lee had spent a lifetime trying to find for herself. The shock felt by some members of the extended family and the social elite at this snub revealed how little they understood the internal life of the woman they had claimed to know. For Lee, it was never about a lack of affection for others, but about a long overdue affirmation of a singular bond. She had lived a life where her value was often measured by who she stood next to: a prince, an artist, a president, but in her final hour she chose to stand for one person only. This was the ultimate expression of the freedom she had first glimpsed decades earlier, the freedom to be decisive, to be unfair by the world's standards, and to be entirely herself. She died as she had lived in her later years, with a fierce commitment to her own taste and her own truth, regardless of how it might be interpreted by the masses. Ultimately, the story of Lee Radziwill is not a tragedy of a life lived in a shadow, but a triumph of a woman who managed to survive that shadow without losing her soul. She was a woman of immense complexity who navigated the highest peaks of social power and the deepest valleys of personal loss with a poise that was never just a mask. By the time the world stopped watching, she had already found the answer to the question that had haunted her since childhood. She was not the other sister. She was Lee, a woman who had curated a world of beauty, endured the unendurable, and finally had the last word on her own terms. Her legacy is not found in the headlines that mention Jackie, but in the quiet, intentional way she closed the book on a life built in comparison, leaving behind a story that was at long last hers alone. The enduring fascination with Lee Radziwill long after her passing suggests that she was far more than a social icon. She was a mirror reflecting the shifting values of the 20th century. While the world was obsessed with the political power of the Kennedys, Lee was quietly mastering the power of personal brand and aesthetic authority before those terms even existed. She understood that while political regimes are temporary, the influence of style and the cultivation of an environment are permanent. Her life serves as a case study in the resilience of the individual spirit against the crushing weight of a family dynasty. She was a woman who refused to be silenced by the enormity of her circumstances, continually reinventing herself in a bid to find a version of reality where she was the author, not just a character in someone else's biography. As historians look back at the Bouvier legacy, the narrative is slowly beginning to shift, recognizing Lee not as a competitor to Jackie but as a distinct force of nature. In many ways, Lee was the more modern of the two sisters, willing to take risks in the public eye, from her foray into acting to her experimental interior designs that the more guarded Jackie would never have considered. Her life was an exploration of the boundaries of female identity, in an era that tried to categorize women by their marriages and their proximity to powerful men. By constantly pushing against these boundaries, Lee carved out a space for a different kind of influence, one that relied on the sharp precision of her intellect and her unparalleled eye for detail. She proved that a life lived in the margins could still be a life of profound substance and lasting impact. The final decision regarding her estate remains the most discussed aspect of her end, but its true significance lies in what it says about the nature of closure. For Lee, the act of leaving everything to her daughter was a way of reclaiming the narrative of her entire life. It was a refusal to participate in the sharing of her identity that had been forced upon her since the 1930s. In those final documents, she was no longer a sister, a princess, or a socialite. She was a mother making a definitive choice for her child. This clarity of purpose is what truly defined her in the end, a woman who had finally stripped away the layers of expectation and performance to reveal a core of steel. She moved from a life of perfect poise to a life of perfect honesty, and in doing so she finally escaped the gravitational pull of the Bouvier hierarchy. To study Lee Radziwill is to study the cost of being the other. It is a story that resonates with anyone who has ever felt overlooked or defined by the success of a sibling or a peer. Yet Lee's story is also one of hope, demonstrating that it is possible to find one's own voice even when the world is shouting someone else's name. Her life reminds us that the headlines are rarely the whole truth, and that the most important decisions are often the ones made when the cameras are turned off. She lived 85 years in the public eye, but her most significant moments happened in the quiet rooms she designed, the private conversations she held, and the final, silent instructions she left behind. She was a woman who lived through history but chose to depart from it on a path of her own making. In the final analysis, Lee Radziwill's life was not a tragedy of comparison, but a masterpiece of self-creation. She took the role she was given and slowly, painfully, and beautifully rewrote the script until it fit her perfectly. When we look at her photos today, the sharp profile, the impeccably tailored suits, the steady gaze, we're seeing a woman who eventually learned to see herself clearly, even if the world took a century to catch up. She remains a symbol of the enduring power of the individual to transcend their circumstances and leave behind a legacy that is as unique and unmistakable as a thumbprint. Lee Radziwill was never just the woman standing next to a princess or a president. She was the woman who survived them all to tell her own story her own way.